Dr. Voltra had discovered that purchasing a slave was much easier than justifying why she had done it. The transaction itself had taken less than an hour, which irritated her more than she wanted to admit. Kelvar Nutrient Systems had accepted the offer with the bland enthusiasm of a company that had already decided the worker was more useful as recovered value than living labor. Several signatures had changed hands, credits had transferred. Ownership records had updated across the collective database with mechanical indifference. After 8 years of documented productivity, specialized certifications, and performance evaluations that should have made any competent owner hesitate, Rose had been sold with less resistance than a damaged scanner. The paperwork that followed had been more difficult than the purchase itself. Voltra spent the next several days navigating transfer forms, medical authorization updates, liability adjustments, tax classifications, asset maintenance declarations, and several documents whose only apparent purpose was to prove that bureaucracy could reproduce without supervision. Each form identified Rose as property. Each form asked Voltra to define her intended use. Each form forced her to explain, in dry administrative language, that she had purchased an injured Flagora slave from an agricultural processing company while the slave remained unconscious in recovery. The facts were all accurate. The arrangement still became more irritating every time she saw it summarized. Vexa had noticed the irritation because Vexa noticed everything, particularly when noticing it allowed her to become quietly judgmental. The nurse stood beside Voltra's desk reviewing a stack of digital forms while Voltra sat behind the monitor with her ears angled backward and her tail tapping slowly against the floor. Several rejected drafts hovered between them. On the nearest one, Voltra had attempted to list Rose's intended use as not being wasted by idiots. The automated system had rejected the entry for insufficient specificity. Voltra considered this further evidence that the system lacked vision. Vexa considered it evidence that the system had developed survival instincts.
You cannot list professional spite as an acquisition purpose,
Vexa said while editing the form before Voltra could make it worse. Her voice remained politely neutral, though her ears betrayed her amusement in the slight backward angle Voltra had learned to recognize.
You need to choose one of the approved categories: domestic service, medical rehabilitation, labor reassignment, personal attendant, experimental recovery case, or private household asset.
Voltra stared at the list as though it had been written specifically to insult her.
Those categories are terrible. Domestic service implies I purchased her to dust things. Medical rehabilitation implies the purchase was made for treatment continuity. Labor reassignment implies I own a farm. Personal attendant implies I want someone standing nearby while I work, which I already have and she is irritating enough. Experimental recovery case implies I purchased her because I intend to test something, and private household assets sounds like somebody tried to make slavery boring.
Vexa made a small correction to the form and did not look up.
Slavery is usually boring from an administrative standpoint. That is one of the many reasons the collective enjoys it.
She glanced toward the next required field, and her expression shifted in a way Voltra did not enjoy.
The system also needs a projected housing location after discharge. You have not entered one.
Voltra leaned back in her chair. The chair gave a faint warning creak beneath her weight, which she ignored because furniture often complained in her presence.
My residence has unused rooms. Enter one of those.
The answer came quickly, too quickly, and Vexa noticed that as well. Voltra had given no indication of planning this decision before speaking, yet the solution appeared fully formed. A private room. Her residence? No work assignment, no immediate transfer, no return to industrial labor. The nurse entered the information without comment, which somehow made the silence more noticeable. The recovery ward was quiet when Voltra arrived later that day, but not the restful sort of quiet administrators like to describe in funding reports. Hospital quiet had texture. Machines breathed softly, monitors clicked, fluids moved through transparent lines. Patients shifted in their beds with the careful motions of creatures testing how much pain reality had saved for them. Voltra moved through the ward with a tablet beneath one arm, and the ownership confirmation still open in one corner of the display. She had not intended to keep the document visible. She simply had not closed it yet. The distinction mattered to her, though she suspected Vexa would have been annoying about it if present. Rose occupied the far bed near the privacy screens. The location had been chosen because Flagora recovery required careful environmental regulation, not because Voltra had personally moved 3 other patients to create a quieter corner. That was the official explanation recorded in the ward management system. It happened to be medically defensible, which made it true enough for paperwork. The area around the bed held humidifiers, nutrient delivery lines, filtered light emitters, and a customized monitoring array that had required Voltra to override the default settings twice before it stopped misreading normal plant-based regeneration as a medical emergency. Voltra approached the bed and began reviewing the charts before looking directly at the patient. The numbers were excellent. Tissue regeneration continued ahead of projections. Vascular repairs remained stable. The grafts had integrated cleanly. Toxin damage was receding. Pain response remained elevated, but that was expected given the extent of the injuries and the fact that Rose's body had recently attempted to dissolve itself from the inside. The doctor adjusted one of the monitors, disliked the way it responded, and adjusted it again until the numbers displayed in a configuration that did not offend her. Only after the medical review found nothing worth correcting did Voltra allow herself to study Rose properly. The Flagora looked less like a surgical disaster and more like a person now, which was inconvenient. Color had returned to the damaged vines along her arms. The flowering structures at her shoulders had begun to open in cautious stages beneath the filtered light. Several sensory tendrils rested across the blanket in loose coils. Without blood, crushed tissue, and emergency alarms demanding attention, the elegance of her biology became more obvious. Flagora had been built by evolution to attract attention and punish whatever came too close. Rose, unconscious and recovering in a hospital bed, somehow still managed to look like something dangerous that had been badly mistreated. A tendril shifted against the blanket while Voltra was adjusting the nutrient flow. The movement was small, but it carried coordination rather than reflex. Another tendril moved a few moments later, curling inward before relaxing again. The monitor registered a change in neurological activity, then a second one, then enough of a pattern for Voltra to lower the tablet and focus on the patient instead of the display. Rose's breathing changed first, her facial structures tightened slightly, her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, and fixed on the ceiling while consciousness dragged the room back into meaning. Voltra remained still while Rose woke. She had learned long ago that patients emerging from deep sedation often reacted badly to sudden movement, though in her experience most patients reacted badly to her in general. Rose's gaze moved from the ceiling to the light emitters, then to the monitor, then to the lines entering her body. Confusion settled across her features, followed by recognition of pain, followed by the careful silence of someone who understood that asking the wrong question in the wrong room could be dangerous. The transition happened quickly enough that Voltra almost missed it. Almost. Then Rose saw her. The fear was immediate but not uncontrolled. That was the first thing Voltra noticed. Rose did not scream. She did not thrash. She did not demand explanations from the enormous chimera standing beside her bed with surgical tools hanging from her coat and a tablet gripped in one clawed hand. Instead, she became very still. Her tendrils tightened against the blanket. Her eyes moved across Voltra's frame in a series of small, precise observations. Height, strength, uniform, tools, tail, stinger, door, distance, restraints. The assessment was fast enough to be instinctive and disciplined enough to be practiced. Voltra found herself more interested in the discipline than the fear. Panic was common. Caution required thought. Rose was terrified, but the fear had not emptied her head. It had sharpened her. That matched the file better than Voltra expected. 8 years of strong evaluations did not belong to someone who collapsed under pressure. They belonged to someone who learned pressure, survived it, and kept functioning anyway.
You are awake.
Voltra said, because it was the most immediately relevant fact, and because patients often became irrational when forced to guess whether the obvious had been noticed. Her voice was not raised, but it still changed something in the room. Rose's body tightened further. The monitor registered an increase in heart rate. Voltra watched the numbers shift and disliked how predictable the response was. Rose looked toward her without quite meeting her eyes. The motion was controlled, respectful, and deeply practiced.
Yes, doctor?
The answer came quietly, with enough care placed around each word to make Voltra think of someone handling broken glass. Rose did not ask where she was. She did not ask what had happened. She did not ask why Voltra was there. That absence of questions said more than any panic would have. Voltra glanced back toward the monitor while giving the patient a moment to orient herself.
You were injured during a transport failure. Several cargo restraints broke loose inside the hold. By the time you reached this hospital, you had severe compression trauma, internal toxin leakage, vascular collapse, structural tearing, and enough fluid loss to make your continued survival statistically irritating.
She adjusted the pain management feed slightly, then continued before Rose could decide whether speaking was safe.
You underwent multiple surgeries. Recovery will be slow, but current projections indicate you will survive with no significant loss of function.
Rose absorbed the information in silence. Her tendrils loosened slightly, then tightened again when she realized they had moved. The reaction interested Voltra and irritated her in equal measure. Even unconscious movement apparently required permission in whatever habits Rose had learned. After several seconds, Rose lowered her gaze further and said,
Thank you for repairing me.
The wording was strange, but not inaccurate. Voltra should have appreciated the efficiency of it. Instead, she found herself thinking about the forms on her desk and the approved categories that had tried to define what Rose was now meant to be.
I performed surgery because surgery was required.
Voltra replied while checking the nearest display again. The monitor gave her no useful excuse to avoid the conversation.
Gratitude is unnecessary, though not as irritating as screaming, so you may continue if you feel strongly about it.
Rose blinked. The movement was subtle, but Voltra caught it. Confusion briefly interrupted the fear, and for half a second something more like personality surfaced beneath the careful restraint. Rose looked as though she was trying to decide whether that had been a joke, an order, a warning, or some obscure chimera medical custom. The uncertainty passed quickly. Caution returned, but it returned over something else now, something Voltra could not yet identify.
Yes, doctor.
Rose said again, though this time the words carried a faint hesitation that had not been there before. She glanced toward the lines attached to her arm, then toward the room beyond Voltra, then back to the blanket.
Am I being returned to Kelvar nutrient systems after recovery?
The question should have been simple. It was exactly the sort of practical concern Voltra preferred. Ownership status, discharge planning, future placement. All of it had already been documented. Yet the way Rose asked it changed the shape of the information. There was fear in the question, but not surprise. Rose expected to be returned. She expected the place that had nearly killed her to remain the place that owned her. The assumption was logical. That made it worse.
No.
Voltra said while opening the ownership confirmation on her tablet. She kept her attention on the document partly because it gave her something to do, and partly because she found Rose's reaction too interesting to watch directly without admitting interest.
Kelvar Nutrient Systems no longer owns you. I purchased your contract 3 days ago.
Rose stopped breathing for a moment. The monitor noticed immediately. Voltra noticed before it did. The silence stretched long enough for several possible interpretations to become available. Relief, terror, confusion, calculation, all of them moved across Rose's face in fragments too controlled to become full expressions. Her tendrils remained still against the blanket, but the stillness had become deliberate. Voltra recognized the difference. The patient was not frozen. She was preventing herself from moving.
I belong to you now.
Rose said. It was not quite a question. The words emerged carefully, shaped around an expectation Voltra did not like. Rose was not asking whether she had been saved. She was determining the terms of the new danger. Voltra looked down at the tablet again. The ownership record was very clear. Asset transfer complete. Prior owner, Kelvar Nutrient Systems. Current owner, Dr. Voltra Sparks. Intended category, private household asset under medical rehabilitation. The language was precise, legal, and suddenly more annoying than it had been that morning.
Yes.
Voltra said because accuracy mattered even when reality made itself unpleasant.
The transfer is complete. Your medical decisions, housing assignment, and future work status now fall under my authority.
Rose nodded once. The motion was small and controlled. Too controlled.
What will you require of me?
She asked, still not looking directly at Voltra. The fear had settled into something organized now. The first shock had passed. She was adapting. Voltra could almost see the file descriptions aligning with the person in front of her. Reliable. Attentive. Quick to adjust. Good under pressure. All those phrases had sounded like productivity metrics yesterday. Now they looked like survival strategies.
I have not decided.
Voltra said, which was true, and therefore should have been sufficient. Rose's reaction suggested it was not. Her tendrils tightened again, and the monitor betrayed another small shift in heart rate. Voltra frowned at the display, then at Rose, then back at the display, as though the machine might explain why the correct answer had made the patient more afraid.
You are recovering from catastrophic injuries. You will not be performing labor until cleared medically. Given the scale of the damage, that will not happen soon.
Rose seemed to process that answer carefully.
Yes, doctor, I understand.
The words were obedient and immediate, but her face revealed very little. Voltra found herself missing the personnel file. Files were honest in their own way. They could be incomplete, biased, or written by idiots, but they did not hide their fear behind politeness. Rose was doing that very efficiently. The doctor adjusted the pain feed again despite the fact that it did not require adjustment. The motion gave her time to think. Voltra had expected questions about injury, ownership, recovery, or price. She had expected confusion. She had even expected panic. What she had not expected was this careful, measured compliance, this constant watchfulness, this immediate assumption that every answer might conceal a threat. It made sense. That was the irritating part. Rose was behaving exactly as a slave should behave around a new owner she did not understand.
You may ask questions.
Voltra said after a moment. The statement came out sharper than intended, which made Rose stiffen again. Voltra noticed, became annoyed by noticing, and forced her tone flatter before continuing.
I prefer informed patients. They waste less time by misunderstanding instructions.
Rose looked toward her then, not fully, not comfortably, but more directly than before.
Why did you buy me?
She asked, and the question landed in the room with far more weight than Voltra appreciated. The doctor had answered that question on 3 different forms: medical continuity, preservation of asset value, prevention of waste, all accurate, all defensible, all suddenly insufficient. Voltra looked back at the ownership record. The glowing text offered no help.
Because your previous owners were idiots.
She said at last. The answer was immediate, honest, and apparently not what Rose expected.
They nearly destroyed a valuable worker through negligence, then considered replacement cheaper than rehabilitation because their analysts lacked the intellectual discipline to understand training costs. Purchasing you was the simplest way to prevent further mismanagement.
Rose stared at her. Voltra stared back. For the first time since waking, Rose looked less afraid than confused. The improvement was small but noticeable.
I was purchased because of accounting?
Rose asked carefully. Voltra's ears lifted slightly.
You were purchased because of bad accounting.
She considered the distinction important enough to clarify.
Good accounting would have recognized your value without my intervention.
Rose continued staring. The fear had not disappeared, but something else had begun to intrude upon it. Not comfort, not trust, not yet. Something closer to disbelief. Voltra found the expression unexpectedly satisfying. It was the first reaction that seemed to belong to Rose rather than to whatever training had taught her how to survive owners. A soft chime sounded from the monitor, reminding both of them that Rose had been awake longer than recommended for the first recovery interval. Voltra silenced it with one claw and reviewed the readings again. Heart rate elevated but stabilizing. Pain response managed. Neurological activity normal. Stress indicators, unpleasant but not dangerous. The numbers were acceptable, though not ideal. The patient was acceptable, though considerably more complicated than the file had suggested.
You need rest.
Voltra said while closing the tablet.
Further questions can wait until you are less recently half dead. If you experience increased pain, difficulty breathing, loss of sensation, uncontrolled tendril spasms, sudden tissue darkening, hallucinations, or any desire to become medically interesting again, press the call control before making it worse.
Rose glanced toward the control beside the bed, then back toward Voltra.
Yes, doctor.
The answer was still careful, still frightened, but the faint confusion remained underneath it. That was acceptable. Confusion was at least more useful than terror. Confusion meant the patient was thinking. Voltra turned to leave, then stopped near the privacy screen when Rose spoke again. The voice was quieter this time, but less automatic.
Dr. Voltra?
Rose waited until the chimera looked back before continuing. Her tendrils shifted against the blanket, not quite relaxing, but no longer perfectly still.
Thank you for not sending me back.
The words produced an uncomfortable pause. Not because Voltra lacked a response, but because several responses appeared and she disliked all of them. She could say it had been practical. She could say Kelvar nutrient systems had proven incompetent. She could say returning Rose would have been wasteful. All of those answers were true. None of them seemed appropriate. After a moment, Voltra settled on the only response that did not require examining the problem further.
Recover properly, and I will consider the investment worthwhile.
Rose lowered her gaze, but not quickly enough to hide the small change in her expression. It was not a smile. The injuries, exhaustion, and fear left no room for anything that simple. Still, something in her softened for a moment before caution covered it again. Voltra saw it, disliked how closely she had been watching, and left the recovery room before the observation became more inconvenient. The ward remained quiet behind her as she walked back toward her office. Several patients avoided looking at her. A nurse stepped out of her path without being asked. The tablet beneath her arm still displayed Rose's updated records, and Voltra closed them with more force than necessary. The meeting had gone adequately. The patient was awake. The patient was frightened, but responsive. The patient asked intelligent questions. The patient had thanked her twice, which remained excessive, but not intolerable. By the time Voltra reached her office, she had already opened Rose's file again.